Thank you, Sister Barbara. It's a delight to be with you in an Augustinian institution, being hosted by a Dominican in the presence of Franciscans and Sisters of St. Joseph and others whom I probably don't even know. It's my first visit to Villanova. I'm glad that I got here. I was at Newman in Aston earlier this year, and someone there said, "I'll look forward to seeing you at Villanova." My laptop had expired in late June, and we had not been able to recover the calendar, so I didn't realize I was coming to Villanova until I was down at Aston, and they reminded me. So I'm doubly delighted that I was here and that I remembered to come. As you can already tell, someone who is that absent-minded might go on a bit. So I think out of a sense of mutual safety and security, if someone has a wristwatch that they would allow me to borrow, that will probably make sure that you get out of here before dinner time. I see one of the TOR friars, Kevin. This was not set up. You actually did this spontaneously. It's always easier to steal things from the friars because they have a way of getting them back. Well, except Kevin, it says it's 4:45, and is that right?
It's a little
5 minutes faster. We want to be out of here by 5:30.
Quarter, whatever.
Yeah.
Just do your thing.
All right. Please feel free to leave at any time. Just genuflect on your way out and leave an offering. The topic that I would like to speak about is a very general one. And for a number of you, it may seem very elementary. Some of you I know are scholars in your own right in the field of Franciscan studies. And for others, this might be quite new, especially those of you who are being educated in an Augustinian university, may not have had a great deal of exposure to Francis and Clare of Assisi. So I'll try to strike a middle ground to give some basic information about these two great saints, but then also to go into a little bit more depth, particularly in regard to some of the unique features of their spirituality. And let me start with a statement that I believe is self-evident. Sometimes the most profound experiences begin with a very simple act. And in the case of the great saints of Assisi, Francis and Clare from the early 13th century, the very simple act was listening to a reading from the Gospel. At Mass, in a small church, in an unimportant part of town, down in an agricultural area. Let me read you the story from the earliest biography that we have of Francis of Assisi, written by his contemporary, one of his brothers, Thomas of Celano. It was written shortly after his death in 1226. Here it is. One day the gospel was being read in that church about how the Lord sent out his disciples to preach. In order to understand better the words of the gospel, he, this is Francis, humbly begged the priest after the Mass to explain the gospel to him. Now realize the gospel was read in Latin. Francis would have spoken an early form of Italian, and he would have studied Latin in school, but to have a whole gospel read in Latin, you might not catch it all. The priest explained it all to him, line by line. When he heard that Christ's disciples should not possess gold or silver or money, or carry on their journey a wallet or a sack, nor bread nor staff, not to have shoes nor 2 tunics, but that they should preach the kingdom of God and penance, Francis immediately exulted in the Spirit of God. "This is what I want," he said. "This is what I seek. This is what I desire with all my heart. Imagine the poor priest at this point. What's going on here? He did not delay before he devoutly began to put into effect what he heard. Immediately, notice that word, immediately, he took off the shoes from his feet, put down the staff from his hands, and, satisfied with one tunic, exchanged his leather belt for a cord. As for the other things he heard, he set about doing them with great care and reverence. I mean, it's a remarkable experience, I suppose, for this priest. There's no evidence that he knew Francis or what he was about. This young man, he would have been in his 20s, early 20s at the time, comes up to him after Mass and said, "Would you explain that gospel you just read?" So he's going through it. This is, okay, do you know what that word means? You know what that, this is discípulos and this is Jesus. Yeah, okay. Explain, okay, next line, explains the whole thing. And at the end, this dramatic reaction. That's what I've been looking for. That's it. Right there. You got it. You said it. That's it. I was waiting for that. I knew. Somehow he had understood enough of the Latin to know there was something there. And when it was finally explained to him, he said, that's it. Look no further. And really, for the rest of his life, Francis does not turn back. Now, there is a build-up to the story. There is a pretext to this text, that Francis had been going through a process, and I'll speak about that in a moment. This didn't come out of the blue. He was looking for something. But when he found it, when he heard it, he recognized it. And he said, that is the thing right there. And I think this is the genius of Franciscan spirituality, whether in Francis or in Clare. It's that turning back to the gospel, the very basic text, the words and the deeds of Jesus proclaimed in the New Testament. It is what we might call basic discipleship, kind of Christianity 101A. It's nothing fancy. It's not complicated. It doesn't require a great deal of complex interpretation, although I've spent the last 20 years trying to figure it out. At its core, it's actually kind of simple. What this kind of discipleship requires, on the other hand, is the very important virtues of sincerity and generosity. The story sounds simple, and that spontaneous response of the young Francis, this is what I want! That's it! You've got it! Right there, in that book. It had lifelong consequences that demanded of him sacrifice and included a fair amount of suffering. So the fact that the response was simple and immediate and direct doesn't mean that the story went on happily ever after. A lot of the time the story was actually pretty dark and difficult, but he didn't turn back. That is also true, however, of the life of any genuine disciple of a master who got himself crucified. And that seems also to be fairly well predicted in the New Testament. If you want to follow this guy, you're going to get into trouble. This young Francesco, as he was called by his friends, in his early 20s had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family of cloth merchants. His dad sold pants, and he sold clothes. That's what he did. He had fought on the side of his hometown of Assisi in a war against a neighboring city, and had been a prisoner of war. That was when he was still in his late teens. He had, like many men of his time, the dream of becoming a knight. He wanted to go fight in the Crusades, which were a big event at the time. That would open the door for him for stepping up socially, to be able to marry into the upper class of Assisi's noble families. He would be Sir Francis instead of just Francis, the guy who sells pants. But he had heard a voice, and quite literally, the ordinary voice of the priest, whose name is not given to us, who was reading the gospel at Mass one day, No indication it was an extraordinary kind of day at all. But in that voice that he heard, as the priest read that gospel in Latin, he heard another word, a word within the words. And it was that word that melted his heart. That's what got that response. This is what I want. That's what I've been looking for. He heard the voice of Jesus speaking to him and giving direction to his life. And as soon as he heard those words, he reacted immediately. The early writer emphasizes that. It wasn't a long process of thinking. That had kind of come before, that searching and looking. He put into action what he heard in the words. So what had been the word heard becomes the fact act. Now turn to Clare, member of the nobility, the upper class, people who wouldn't socialize with people like Francesco and his family who sold cloth. Clare was from the aristocracy, but she would end up joining Francis and some of his early companions when she was in her late teens. She had already rejected several offers of arranged marriage, and we have testimony from the marriage broker who had tried to barter with her about suitable partners which her uncles had chosen. And she said no, 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 and started preaching to him about changing his life and straightening up, which took him somewhat by surprise. She had been looking around, apparently, with some concern at the poor of the city of Assisi, reserving portions of food that had been set aside for her use in the household, and secretly distributing them to people who were working on the repair of churches in the neighborhood. And we think one of those people might have been Francis in the early days of his conversion. We know that she had heard Francis after his conversion in his early attempts at preaching in the town of Assisi. We don't know on what occasions. And we know that she had arranged a few meetings with him to discuss what she was looking for, and that she had finally come to a decision. She's a little bit more deliberate than Francis. Clare kind of works her way through the steps, maybe not quite as impetuous. But she came to the decision that she also wanted to follow that way of life that relied on the gospel as its pattern. So, on the evening of Palm Sunday, in the year 1212, under cover of night, without her parents' consent, this intelligent, aristocratic teenager simply ran away from home, walked with a friend in the dark from the town down to this little abandoned chapel called St. Mary of the Angels of the Porciuncula. It's actually the church that gives the name to the city of Los Angeles. So LA actually has a longer name. It's the city of Our Lady of the Angels of the Porciuncula of the Southern River, named for this place where St. Clare went. There, next to the leper hospital of the town, she met Francis and his brothers that night. And they were waiting for her. They knew that she was coming. They had torches out, and they were ready to greet her. She made a commitment there and then. She asked that her hair be cut off and that her head be covered with a veil, a sign of religious consecration. Carried out by these amateurs, Francis and his brothers, who had no permission from anyone to do this. It's a little bit of a problem, but it's okay. And her family, the next morning, guess what? Discovered that number one marriageable daughter is gone.